In the beginning, long before the rise of stone cities and the roar of civilization, the world was a cathedral of green. Mist clung to ancient forests, the air thick with the scent of moss and earth, and the first humans moved quietly beneath the towering trees, aware that something watched them. Not a human eye, not a beast of fur or claw, but a presence intangible, eternal, and as ancient as the wind itself. Here, in the silent heart of the forest, the earliest whispers of divinity first stirred. The first gods were not carved, painted, or written about. They lived in the rustle of leaves, the curve of a river, the hollow of an oak. Every shadow held a secret. Every clearing was a sacred theater. To walk among these trees was to walk in the company of something far greater than oneself. The forests of prehistory were more than mere landscapes. They were sanctuaries and schools. The first humans, hunters and gatherers, learned to read the signs of the natural world not merely for survival, but for guidance. The direction of the wind, the song of a bird, the bending of branches became language. To them the earth spoke, and in that speech, the divine made itself known. It was a subtle language, one that required patience, reverence, and a humility modernity has largely forgotten. These early men and women knew that the forest was alive, not just with animals and insects, but with spirit. They knew that the world itself was not silent, and in that knowledge, the first embers of religion and myth were kindled. Imagine a clearing at dawn, mist curling like ghosts between the trunks. A lone figure stands barefoot on the damp earth, breath visible in the crisp air, hands raised in instinctive awe. The figure senses, without understanding, the pulse of life that flows through the grove. Here, the first rituals took place not in temples of stone, but in open spaces where the sun filtered through leaves, and the world itself became altar and offering. The prayers of these early people were not words as we know them. They were gestures, songs, and offerings of food, water, and fire, given in gratitude or plea. To honor the forest was to honor the forces that sustained life. And in this act, the forest, the human, and the divine were bound together in a fragile, sacred triangle. The gods of the grove were not distant rulers or moral judges. They were intimately woven into the fabric of daily existence. One did not simply worship a tree. One spoke with it, sought counsel from it, and in some sense, lived within it. The first deities were fluid, shapeless, capable of manifesting as wind, rain, or the sudden shadow of an animal. They were both protectors and punishing forces, tender and terrible, reflecting the mercurial nature of the world itself. This duality, the gentle whisper of blessing and the roar of retribution, became the defining characteristic of early pagan spirituality. Life in the forest taught humans to respect power that was neither human nor fully comprehensible. Fear and love, awe and gratitude were intertwined like the roots of the trees beneath their feet. The sacred grove also became a mirror for human society. Small tribes and clans learned to gather, to share, and to create rituals that reinforced communal bonds. Around the oldest oaks and yews, stories were told, stories of ancestral heroes, spirits of the land, and gods who demanded attention and respect. These groves were the first schools of morality, yet their lessons were never abstract. They were tangible, rooted in the cycles of growth, death, and rebirth that the forest displayed so clearly. To witness a fallen tree decaying into the soil was to witness the divine law of impermanence. To see new shoots sprout in the place of the dead was to see the promise of renewal. Humanity learned, in those earliest groves, that the sacred is inseparable from the natural world. But not all encounters with the forest were gentle. There were dark corners where shadows seemed alive and the wind carried voices no human should hear. The same groves that nurtured life could take it with swift, silent precision through storms, predators, or disease. In these spaces, humans first understood that divinity could be terrifying, that gods could test, punish, or demand sacrifice. Fear was not simply a tool for control. It was a recognition of the fragility of human existence and the enormity of the world beyond comprehension. Every snapping branch or rustling leaf could be a warning or a lesson, a moment of reflection on mortality, humility, and the precariousness of life itself. Through these early forests, humans began the most profound of journeys, the birth of imagination, of myth, of story. They could not see the gods, yet they felt their presence. They spoke to them, and in doing so, they brought them into the world of human consciousness. The sacred grove became a stage upon which the first legends were enacted, where the divine danced among mortals in invisible rhythms. Every step upon the forest floor was a prayer. Every glance skyward was an inquiry. And though centuries would pass before the first written word captured these stories, the forests themselves remembered. They whispered, and those whispers traveled across generations, carrying the seed of belief that would one day grow into the vast, intricate pantheons of Europe and beyond. The first gods, then, were not symbols but experiences. They were the wind through the branches, the sudden flash of a fox's eye, the smell of rain on soil. They were the pulse of life itself, and the groves were their temples, their classrooms, and their homes. As humans walk these sacred spaces, they learned the most ancient truth, that the divine is not separate from the world, but immanent within it, hiding in plain sight, waiting for those who have the patience to listen. And so, the whispering leaves of the first gods carried their voices to the hearts of men and women, planting the first seeds of reverence, awe, and myth. A story that would, in time, echo across millennia, shaping the way humanity understands life, nature, and the sacred. Beneath the surface of the earth, beneath the roots of the oldest oaks and the thick moss of forgotten clearings, lie the earliest murmurs of divinity, echoes of a time when humans first tried to name what they felt but could not see. The gods did not begin as statues, temples, or texts. They began as impulses, sensations, and instincts. A shadow stretching unnaturally at dusk, the sudden flight of birds from a silent glade, the rhythmic crash of a river against rocks. These were the first signs that life carried a pattern, a mind, a power beyond human reckoning. To the first humans, each grove, each riverbend, and each mountaintop was an altar, and each stone, leaf, and gust of wind could carry a voice. They did not yet speak of Zeus, Odin, or Cernunnos. They spoke in breathless awe, in reverent silence, in rituals that even we, centuries later, can scarcely imagine. The transition from unshaped instinct to conscious worship was gradual, yet monumental. Tribes began to recognize patterns, birth and death, the cycle of seasons, the waxing and waning of the moon, and they attributed these forces to powers that were not themselves. These forces were sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, and sometimes indifferent. In them, humans discerned personalities, moods, and desires. Over generations, these abstract forces became embodied in imagined beings, gods with anger and compassion, caprice and wisdom. And these beings were not distant. They were near, woven into the very fabric of the world, demanding attention, offering favor, punishing negligence. Early divinities were reflections of life's unpredictability, mirrors of human fear and hope, and templates for the moral imagination that would shape human society. Yet, the roots of divinity were as much a product of the land as of human perception. Geography and climate shaped the gods as much as human thought did. In northern forests, where winter threatened death at every turn, deities embodied endurance, survival, and the fierce guardianship of the tribe. In river valleys and fertile plains, gods represented abundance, fertility, and the rhythmic generosity of the earth. Mountains became seats of power, forests became sanctuaries, and the sea became both a giver and taker of life. Every natural feature, every seasonal pattern, every recurrent hazard was incorporated into the mental tapestry of divine imagination. Humanity did not create gods in isolation. They were co-created with the land, inseparable from the wind, stone, and soil that surrounded them. In these early religions, there was no hierarchy as we later understand it. Gods were local, intimate, and specific. A spring could have its guardian, a hill its protector, a grove its patron. Offerings were personal, immediate, and tangible. A carved figurine placed at the base of a tree, a small portion of hunted meat left by the riverbank, a carefully lit fire at the edge of a clearing. There were no sacred books, no codified doctrines. The worship was experiential, lived, and inseparable from daily survival. And in this, there is a profound lesson. Divinity, in its first incarnation, was not distant or abstract. It was profoundly present, immediate, and essential to life itself. Over time, human imagination elevated these local spirits into more complex pantheons. Names were given, lineages imagined, rivalries dramatized. In Europe, these early pantheons would crystallize into the gods of Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic myth, each pantheon reflecting the environment, economy, and culture of its people. Yet, even as the myths grew, the root remained the same. Divinity was inseparable from nature. The forests, the rivers, the mountains, they were not mere backdrops. They were active participants in the sacred narrative. And thus, the first gods were never entirely human, yet never entirely alien. They were bridges, intermediaries between the mortal and the ineffable, between the seen and the unseen. And yet, the roots of divinity also fed the imagination of fear. Every rustle in the undergrowth could conceal blessing or peril. Gods were capricious, powerful, and morally complex. They were not guides to comfort the weak, but forces to test resilience, courage, and wisdom. Humans learned to read signs, to interpret omens, and to offer propitiation, not just in hope, but in recognition of the unpredictable, dangerous, and beautiful forces that shape their lives. The forest, in this sense, was both cradle and crucible of the first gods, a place where the mortal and immortal intersected in profound, often terrifying ways. By the time small tribes began forming permanent settlements, the first gods had already been etched into the human psyche. They were no longer fleeting whispers. They were stories, rituals, and taboos, shaping behavior, morality, and social cohesion. They demanded respect for the earth, reverence for the cycles of life, and attentiveness to the unseen. The roots of divinity, intertwined with the roots of trees, had taken hold in human consciousness, and from them would grow the great pantheons of Europe gods, of thunder and fertility, of war and wisdom, of life and death. These roots remind us, even today, that before temples rose from stone, before prayers were written, humanity first learned to listen, and in listening, the divine was born. There is a silence in the heart of the forest that humbles the spirit, a silence that feels alive, as if the trees themselves are listening. In these sacred groves, long before stone temples or gilded altars, humanity first discovered a space where the divine was tangible. Here, the forest became sanctuary, not merely a refuge from the elements, but a threshold between the world of men and the realm of gods. Every step on moss and fallen leaves carried weight. Every glance into shadow held significance. To enter the grove was to leave behind the mundane, to step into a living cathedral where the air shimmered with unseen presence. The canopy filtered sunlight like stained glass, casting ethereal patterns upon the forest floor. And the rustling of leaves was more than wind, it was the voice of the sacred. Sanctuary in the grove was not only spiritual but social. These spaces served as gathering places where tribes and clans met in solemn assembly, where the rituals of birth, death, and passage were observed. The grove was both classroom and courtroom, temple and theater. Elders told stories beneath the protective branches of yews and oaks, children learned the names of trees, rivers, and stars, and warriors offered prayers before journeys into unknown lands. The forest became a repository of communal memory, a living archive of human experience intertwined with divine witness. To step into the grove was to participate in a dialogue that spanned generations, a dialogue where the living spoke with the spirits of ancestors and gods alike. Within these sanctuaries, the natural world itself became a participant in human devotion. Streams gurgled like sacred hymns, rocks and boulders became altars, and certain trees gnarled, ancient, impossibly wide, were revered as dwelling places of gods. Pilgrims and worshippers would leave small offerings at their bases. Carved figurines, polished stones, fragments of food, and the occasional woven cloth. Each token was a bridge between human hands and divine favor, a silent conversation with a force that could neither be captured nor constrained. The grove was alive, a living temple whose architecture was organic, ever-changing, and impermanent, yet eternal in its sacred resonance. These groves were also theaters of initiation. Young men and women, approaching adulthood, were often led deep into sacred woods in rites that tested endurance, insight, and respect for the unseen. In the dim green light, guided by elders or priests, initiates confronted fear, solitude, and the mysteries of life and death. To emerge from the grove unscathed was to gain knowledge, status, and spiritual connection. To fail was a lesson both humbling and transformative. The forest became a crucible, a sacred space where identity was forged in communion with the divine and with the wild forces of nature. Every moss-covered rock, every winding path became a teacher. The grove's sanctity was enhanced by its inaccessibility. Often, sacred groves were hidden in valleys, atop hills, or within dense forests, places difficult for outsiders to approach. Their isolation preserved mystery and protected the sacred from mundane intrusion. Even within the community, access might be restricted to those with specific roles, priests, elders, or initiates, ensuring that the grove remained a place apart, set aside from ordinary life. This separation reinforced the idea that the divine could not be commanded or contained. It demanded respect, patience, and discernment. In doing so, groves became not only sacred spaces, but instruments of social and spiritual order. Ultimately, the grove as sanctuary reflects humanity's earliest understanding of the sacred, that it is inseparable from life itself. The forest provided food, shelter, and raw materials, but it also provided a moral and spiritual framework. It taught humans about cycles of growth and decay, about resilience and fragility, about reverence and reciprocity. To dwell within a grove was to inhabit a space where every sound, scent, and shadow carried meaning, and where the boundary between mortal and divine was permeable, ever-shifting, and alive. In this living cathedral, humanity first glimpsed what would become the enduring dialogue between earth, spirit, and the gods, a conversation that continues, faint yet insistent, through the ages. In the dim light of dawn, when mist lingers among the trunks of ancient trees and dew clings to every leaf, humanity first began to imagine gods in forms it could understand. The divine, once invisible and ineffable, slowly took shape in human likeness. Eyes that could see, hands that could hold, voices that could speak. These anthropomorphic gods were not merely reflections of mortal beings. They were magnified, eternalized, and intensified. Strength, wisdom, rage, and love were embodied in them, cast in forms both terrifying and comforting. To imagine a god was to render the unknown comprehensible, to provide a mirror in which human society could glimpse both its ideals and its fears. Anthropomorphism allowed humans to establish intimacy with the divine. The gods could now interact, negotiate, and respond in ways that the abstract forces of nature could not. They could grant blessings, punish offenses, or demand loyalty. These human-shaped deities were often paradoxical, tender and cruel, wise and capricious, ever watchful yet distant. In one breath, a god could nurture a child. In the next, smite a warrior for hubris. This duality reflected the precariousness of human life and the volatile character of the natural world. The forest, river, and storm became stages upon which these divine personalities acted, shaping human understanding of morality, power, and fate. The transformation of gods into human forms was not uniform. It evolved alongside culture and geography. In the rolling hills of Gaul, the gods reflected fertility, harvest, and the unpredictability of the season. Among the Germanic peoples, deities embodied strength, courage, and protection, often linked with the thunder, the oak, or the hunt. Each society painted the divine with the colors of its environment and its values. Gods became storytellers' tools, moral guides, and psychological anchors, allowing humans to interpret the chaos of existence in ways they could grasp. Yet beneath these forms lay the enduring essence of the sacred, the recognition that all life is interconnected, fragile and deserving of reverence. Ritual practice intertwined with these human-shaped deities. Offerings, chants, and ceremonies often address specific attributes or behaviors of the gods. A deity of fertility might be invoked at planting or childbirth, while a god of war would be called upon before battle. Temples, shrines, and groves became stages for these interactions, each space imbued with the personality and presence of its resident god. To honor the divine in human form was to acknowledge not only its power, but its accessibility, a recognition that the god could be appeased, persuaded, or honored through human action. It was an intimate, reciprocal relationship that demanded attentiveness, moral awareness, and ritual skill. Yet, anthropomorphic gods were never mere reflections of humanity's best qualities. They embodied extremes, magnifying human emotions into epic forces. Love became obsessive and dangerous. Anger became destructive and relentless. Jealousy became divine judgment. Through these forms, humans explored the complexity of their own psyche. Myths of gods' triumphs, betrayals, and vengeance served as cautionary tales, moral instruction, and entertainment. They reminded the faithful that divinity was powerful, unpredictable, and inescapably tied to the natural and social order. In a sense, humans shaped the gods even as the gods shaped humans, in a symbiotic dance of imagination, fear, and reverence. The physical depiction of gods also reinforced social norms and hierarchies. Kings, warriors, and priests could claim divine favor or descent, linking human authority with celestial power. Mortals who embodied or invoked the traits of gods could gain prestige, influence, and legitimacy. This fusion of divinity and humanity extended beyond ritual into governance, law, and community cohesion. Gods in human form were simultaneously metaphysical forces and social instruments, guiding behavior, inspiring courage, and instilling awe. Their human-like traits made them comprehensible yet formidable, approachable yet transcendent, bridging the gap between mortal limitation and divine possibility. Ultimately, the gods in human form reveal an essential truth about the origins of religious imagination. The sacred is not separate from human life, it grows from it. By giving the divine a familiar face, humans were able to confront mortality, chaos, and the vast unknown. They were able to ask questions, offer pleas, and interpret signs in ways that were intelligible and emotionally resonant. In these human-shaped gods, the sacred became relatable, tangible, and morally instructive. And yet, despite their human attributes, these deities remained eternal, omnipresent, and unknowable in their full complexity, a paradox that would define pagan belief for millennia. In the shadowed groves, amidst whispering leaves and sacred stones, humans first learned to look at themselves through the eyes of the divine, and in doing so, discovered both humility and wonder. Beneath the vaulted canopy of ancient forests, where sunlight filtered through leaves in trembling shafts of gold and green, the first rituals were performed. These ceremonies were not orchestrated by architects of stone or marble, but by the rhythms of the earth itself. A grove became a theater of devotion, its floor carpeted with moss, fallen leaves, and the occasional spring of wildflowers, each element a participant in the sacred drama. Rituals were both intimate and communal. A solitary prayer whispered into the wind, or a chorus of voices echoing in unison under the branches of oaks that had witnessed countless generations. Every motion, every gesture, every uttered sound was charged with significance, a dialogue between human and divine that transcended word. The oak, in particular, was revered above all other trees. Its mighty trunk, gnarled roots, and expansive canopy symbolized endurance, wisdom, and connection between earth and sky. Ancient peoples believed that the spirits of gods could dwell within these towering sentinels, and that approaching them with reverence could bring protection, insight, or favor. Around these oaks, rituals were structured to reflect cosmic balance. Offerings of food, drink, or crafted tokens were placed at their roots. Fires might be lit in small clearings, smoke rising like prayers to the heavens. Chants were sung to mark the cycles of the sun, moon, and seasons. Each action was a thread weaving humans into the greater tapestry of life and divinity, a recognition that survival and prosperity depended on harmonious alignment with unseen forces. Rituals were also deeply performative. Movements, gestures, and postures were codified in ways that expressed respect, humility, and supplication. A raised hand, a bow, or a circular procession could signify submission to divine authority or gratitude for blessings received. Music and dance often accompanied these ceremonies, creating a sensory bridge between the corporeal and spiritual realms. Drums echoed the heartbeat of the earth. Flutes mimicked the whispers of wind through leaves, and collective chants synchronized human breath with the rhythm of life. These practices were not entertainment. They were acts of communion, shaping consciousness and reaffirming the sacred order. Yet, the rituals were not solely celebratory. Many were designed to appease or placate, to ward off misfortune, or to honor the passage of souls. Sacrifices ranging from food to symbolic offerings were understood as necessary gestures of reciprocity, acknowledgement that life itself was borrowed from forces greater than humans. At times, these rites could be austere, somber, even terrifying, reflecting the dual nature of the gods as both benevolent and wrathful. To perform a ritual improperly was to risk divine displeasure. To neglect it entirely was to invite chaos. In this way, rituals cultivated mindfulness, moral responsibility, and a profound respect for the balance between human agency and cosmic forces. The seasons dictated the cadence of these ceremonies. Spring brought fertility rites, celebrating the awakening of plants and animals, and imploring the gods for bountiful harvests. Summer emphasized growth, abundance, and protection, often involving communal feasts and dances. Autumn rituals honored the harvest and acknowledged mortality as leaves fell and the forest prepared for winter's quiet dominion. Winter, in turn, was a time of introspection, honoring ancestors, the unseen, and the cyclical return of life. Each ritual was thus a reflection of the human need to mark time, understand mortality, and seek continuity within the ever-turning wheel of existence. Rituals also reinforced social cohesion. Leaders, priests, and elders guided these ceremonies, transmitting sacred knowledge and moral instruction through performance. Initiates learned not only the gestures and chants, but the deeper philosophy embedded within them: respect for nature, empathy for community, and humility before the divine. Stories, myths, and cosmologies were recited and enacted during these gatherings, embedding cultural memory within the structure of ceremony. Through repetition and immersion, ritual became a living bridge between generations, sustaining both spiritual practice and social identity. Ultimately, rituals among the Oaks were more than acts of worship. They were embodiments of human understanding, fear, gratitude, and hope. The groves themselves were participants in these sacred dramas, and in every whispered chant and flickering fire, the human and divine danced together. To witness or partake in these ceremonies was to glimpse the invisible, to touch the eternal, and to recognize that life was not merely survival, but a continuous engagement with forces larger than oneself. In the shadow of ancient oaks, humanity first learned that devotion was not passive. It was active, embodied, and inseparable from the living world. And so, the rituals endured, echoing through centuries, a testament to the enduring power of sacred space and the human need to reach toward the divine. Amid the silence of ancient forests, there existed a peculiar reverence for certain trees, a recognition that some groves were more than mere timber and leaf. They were vessels of wisdom, portals to the unseen, oracles of fate. The rustling of leaves was not merely wind, nor the bending of branches random. Every movement, every sound carried messages from the divine. Humans, attuned to these subtle signs, learned to listen, to touch the bark of a sacred oak, to follow the curve of a river through a grove, to notice the patterns of shadows at twilight. These were acts of divination, gestures of communion with the spiritual forces woven into the natural world. In this sacred attentiveness, the forest became a living library, its pages written in leaves, roots, and the rhythm of the seasons. Among the Celts, for example, certain trees were believed to possess prophetic powers. The oak, towering and steadfast, was revered as the seat of ultimate wisdom, its trunk a conduit between earth and sky. Druids, acting as intermediaries between gods and men, would interpret the rustling of leaves, the direction of falling acorns, or the patterns of lightning as messages from the divine. These readings were not superstitious whims. They were disciplined practices, requiring years of observation, intuition, and experience. The forest, in essence, became a classroom, and the tree, a teacher. Every movement and sound was imbued with meaning, and the attentive observer could discern guidance for decisions both mundane and monumental. The practice of consulting trees extended beyond Europe. Across the world, humans recognized certain trees as repositories of ancestral knowledge and divine insight. In Slavic lands, birches were linked with protection and prophecy. While in Norse regions, the Ash Yggdrasil served as a cosmic axis connecting heaven, earth, and the underworld. These sacred trees were liminal, existing between worlds, and humans approached them with humility. Offerings, songs, or silent contemplation were offered in exchange for guidance. The act of seeking counsel in a grove was as much about attuning oneself to natural rhythms as it was about interpreting the voice of the divine, a discipline of patience, observation, and empathy. The tree as oracle also shaped political and social decisions. Leaders, warriors, and judges often sought divine insight before battles, treaties, or governance. An interpreted rustle of leaves could confirm a course of action or signal danger. Tribes and clans relied on these readings, trusting the wisdom of the grove over personal inclination or fleeting counsel. In this way, the forest was not only sacred but practical, an institution of decision-making, a living court of wisdom. Humanity, still small and vulnerable, found guidance in the patient, impartial language of nature itself. Yet oracular trees were capricious, demanding respect and humility. Misreading a sign or approaching with arrogance could bring calamity. Lightning could strike without warning, branches could fall unexpectedly, and the quiet stillness of the grove could turn menacing. The oracles taught a lesson that would echo through centuries. The divine is not a servant of human desire, but a force to be understood, negotiated with, and respected. This blend of fear and reverence cultivated moral discipline, courage, and attentiveness to the natural order, laying the foundation for later religious and philosophical systems. The symbolic resonance of these trees extended beyond prediction. They became metaphors for human life, resilience, and interconnectedness. The roots that dug into the soil, unseen yet sustaining, mirrored the hidden connections binding communities and generations. The branches, reaching skyward, reflected aspiration, hope, and the quest for knowledge. Seasonal cycles, leafing, flowering, fruiting, shedding taught lessons about impermanence, renewal, and the inevitability of change. The grove, in its oracular function, was therefore both teacher and mirror, revealing the patterns of the world and the human role within it. In the end, trees, as oracles, reveal a profound truth. The divine was not distant, abstract, or unreachable. It was alive in the world around early humans, speaking through every leaf, branch, and root. To enter a grove with intention, to observe with humility, to interpret with care, was to participate in a dialogue that connected human consciousness to the rhythms of the universe. The oracular tree embodies the earliest human desire to know, to understand, and to harmonize with forces far greater than ourselves. And so, the wisdom whispered among the leaves shaped decisions, beliefs, and stories, ensuring that the sacred forest remained, above all, a place where humans could listen and, in listening, glimpse the divine. In the shadow depths of Europe's ancient forests, where sunlight fractured through leaves like scattered gold, the Druids emerged as the custodians of sacred knowledge. They were not kings or warriors, yet their authority rivaled that of any monarch. They were not mere villagers, yet they were the heart of their communities. Guardians of the groves, interpreters of omens, and keepers of ancestral wisdom, Druids occupied a liminal space between mortal and divine, nature and society, secrecy and revelation. To encounter a Druid was to confront a figure whose mind was as deep as the roots of the oaks they revered, whose knowledge of the cosmos rivaled the vastness of the forests themselves. They were the living bridge between humanity and the gods, translating the language of wind, leaf, and stone into guidance, law, and ritual. The Druidic tradition was as mysterious as it was influential. Their teachings were never committed to writing, for the spoken word carried sanctity and power, and secrecy was essential to preserving their authority. Knowledge was passed orally from mentor to initiate, often over decades of study. Astronomy, herbalism, law, poetry, and ritual were all interwoven into their education, forming a holistic system that saw no separation between the practical and the spiritual. A Druid could read the stars as easily as the forest floor, predict the changing of seasons, and mediate disputes between tribes. Their minds were archives of human and natural history, their memories living repositories of the sacred and the profane. Druids also held power in their ability to interpret omens and portents. They were keen observers of nature and human behavior, trained to recognize signs invisible to the uninitiated. The flight of birds, the fall of acorns, the whisper of the wind through a particular branch. Each held layers of meaning. Warriors consulted druids before battle. Leaders sought their judgment in governance. Families asked for guidance in matters of survival and prosperity. In these acts, the Druidic legacy intertwined practical wisdom with spiritual authority, demonstrating that knowledge of the world and reverence for the divine were inseparable. But the Druids were more than ritualists or advisors, they were philosophers in their own right. They reflected deeply on the cycles of life, the nature of the soul, and humanity's place within the cosmos. They taught that all life was interconnected, that harm to one part of the natural world echoed throughout existence, and that death was a passage, not an end. These ideas, radical in their time, challenged simplistic notions of power and hierarchy. The Druidic mind was both analytical and mystical, capable of discerning patterns in the world while remaining attuned to its ineffable mysteries. In a sense, they were the first scientists, poets, and theologians rolled into one, practicing a form of knowledge that recognized both the tangible and the transcendent. Druidic influence extended beyond individual communities. Their wisdom shaped the ethical, social, and religious fabric of entire regions, ensuring that sacred groves remained protected, rituals observed, and myths preserved. Even as empires rose and expanded, threatening to eradicate old beliefs, the Druids maintained the continuity of a spiritual tradition rooted in nature, observation, and the human quest for understanding. Their presence was subtle but profound, a quiet but unyielding force, linking the past to the present, the mortal to the eternal. Ultimately, the Druidic legacy is a testament to humanity's earliest attempts to harmonize intellect, intuition, and devotion. They remind us that knowledge is sacred when paired with responsibility, that power is tempered by humility, and that the human spirit thrives when attuned to the rhythms of the world. In the groves they protected, in the rituals they guided, and in the teachings they passed down, Druids forged a path between humanity and the divine, a path that echoes still in modern imagination, in folklore, and in the enduring reverence for nature itself. Their legacy is the memory of listening deeply, of seeking guidance in the whispers of leaves, and of remembering that the sacred is never distant, only waiting to be understood. High above the forest floor, where sunlight filters like molten gold through a cathedral of leaves, the early peoples of Europe began to see patterns in the chaos around them. Night and day, birth and death, storm and calm, they recognized cycles, repetitions, rhythms that demanded explanation. From these observations emerged the first cosmologies, intricate, poetic, and deeply symbolic frameworks in which the universe, humanity, and the gods were intertwined. The forest, the river, the mountain, and the sky were not mere scenery. They were actors in a living drama, each carrying moral weight, divine energy, and purpose. To the pagan mind, the world itself was alive, and every action echoed within it. Pagan cosmologies were rarely singular or uniform. Each culture wove its own understanding of the universe from the threads of experience, myth, and environment. In Celtic lands, the otherworld, an invisible realm of spirits and ancestors, was ever present, overlapping with the mortal plane, its borders thin and permeable within sacred groves and riverbanks. Germanic peoples envisioned Yggdrasil, the cosmic ash, whose roots and branches connected the realms of gods, humans, and the dead, a living symbol of order, balance, and interconnection. Slavic tradition spoke of spirits inhabiting rivers, trees, and stones, creating a universe teeming with consciousness, where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was subtle and often fleeting. In all these cosmologies, the human role was clear: to observe, honor, and live in alignment with the forces that governed existence. The gods themselves were mapped onto the cosmos, each embodying forces of nature, society, and human psychology. Sun gods illuminated and nurtured life. Storm gods brought both destruction and renewal. Fertility goddesses ensured the continuation of life. These divine archetypes were never abstract. They were lived experiences, intimately tied to the cycles of growth, decay, and renewal that governed human survival. To honor a god was to acknowledge the rhythm of existence itself, to participate consciously in the cosmic order. Cosmology, in this sense, was practical as well as spiritual. It guided planting and harvesting, hunting and war, marriage and mourning. In pagan thought, sacred groves functioned as microcosms of the universe. The towering trees symbolized cosmic pillars, the undergrowth mirrored the mysteries of the earth, and the canopy connected humans to the heaven. Within these spaces, rituals mirrored cosmic processes. Seasonal festivals celebrated the sun's journey. Rites of passage reflected cycles of birth, growth, and death, and sacrificial offerings acknowledged the constant interplay of life and energy. The grove itself became a living model of the universe, an immersive lesson in the principles of balance, reciprocity, and sacred continuity. Time in pagan cosmology was cyclical, not linear. The sun, moon, and stars governed recurring patterns that reinforced the inevitability of change, the interdependence of life, and the promise of renewal. Humans were not rulers of this time but participants, bound to rhythms far larger than themselves. Festivals marked solstices and equinoxes, reflecting awareness of celestial cycles and their terrestrial consequences. These celebrations were simultaneously joyous and solemn, communal and contemplative, linking human consciousness with the steady pulse of the cosmos. In doing so, cosmology shaped not only belief, but behavior, ethics, and social structure. Moral and philosophical lessons were embedded within these cosmologies. Gods and spirits were not always benevolent. Their caprice mirrored the unpredictability of nature and the fragility of human life. Respect, humility, courage, and reciprocity were essential virtues. To violate sacred laws by cutting a tree without offering, by neglecting ritual, or by breaking taboos was to invite misfortune. These cosmologies reinforce the delicate balance between human agency and divine oversight, teaching that power is inseparable from responsibility, and that survival depends on attentiveness, cooperation, and reverence. Ultimately, pagan cosmologies reveal a worldview in which the sacred and the mundane are inseparable. They remind us that humans have always sought to understand their place within a universe alive with energy, consciousness, and mystery. The groves, the rivers, the mountains, these were not merely backdrops for myth, but living frameworks in which humans, gods, and nature intersected. To step into such a worldview was to see life as a dialogue, a dance, and a covenant with forces far greater than oneself. In this vision, the universe was not inert. It was a living, breathing, moral, and sacred whole. And humanity's first lesson was to listen, observe, and honor the intricate web in which all life was bound. Across the breadth of Europe, from mist-laden Celtic hills to the frozen reaches of the Norse North, certain trees were more than mere life. They were divine, sacred, and eternal. The reverence for these living monuments transcended language, tribe, and geography. Every culture, in its own way, recognized that trees were conduits to the gods, witnesses to human lives, and repositories of ancestral memory. The oak, with its mighty trunk and sprawling branches, became the emblem of strength and wisdom. The yew, with its dark foliage and longevity, spoke of death, rebirth, and eternal continuity. To approach such a tree was to approach a portal, a liminal space where the mortal and immortal could meet, and the human spirit could touch the divine. In Celtic traditions, sacred trees formed the very heart of community life. Groves were meticulously preserved, and certain trees, known as bile, were revered as dwelling places of gods or spirits. Tribes would travel miles to lay offerings at their roots, seeking guidance, protection, or blessing. Some trees became central to the mythology of entire regions, their names whispered in prayers and woven into stories of heroes, warriors, and gods. The reverence for these living sentinels was not symbolic alone. It was practical, ensuring that resources critical for survival were protected, while also creating a spiritual anchor that linked generations. Among the Germanic peoples, the ash tree, Yggdrasil, stood at the cosmic center, a living axis connecting realms of gods, humans, and the dead. Its roots dug deep into the underworld, its branches stretched into the heavens, and its trunk was home to countless spirits, serpents, and birds of divine import. Here, the sacred tree was a cosmological map, a symbol of balance and interconnectedness, demonstrating that life and death, heaven and earth, were part of a single interwoven reality. Warriors and rulers would seek counsel from such groves, performing rituals that honored both ancestors and divine overseers. Every act in the presence of Yggdrasil, or its symbolic counterparts, was a reminder that humans were participants, not masters, of the natural and spiritual order. In Slavic forests, sacred trees held spirits, known as leshy guardians of the woodland, who could bless, mislead, or punish. Birches, elms, and lindens were especially revered, often adorned with offerings, ribbons, or carvings that marked human acknowledgement of their presence. Travelers leaving offerings hoped to secure safe passage. Villagers sought bountiful harvests through rituals around these arboreal guardians. The moral and spiritual authority of trees was palpable, creating a framework in which humans acted with attentiveness, respect, and ritualized interaction. Here, too, the sacred tree was both spiritual and practical, a symbol of life's continuity and the unseen order that governed it. Trees as sacred beings were not merely static objects of worship. They were dynamic participants in human existence. Seasons marked their growth and decay, and the cycles of leafing, flowering, fruiting, and shedding mirrored human life, mortality, and renewal. To witness a tree through these cycles was to witness the rhythm of existence itself. In pagan belief, the health of a tree often reflected the moral or spiritual state of the community. A dying grove could signal neglect, disrespect, or divine displeasure. These natural signs became embedded in rituals, laws, and ethics, ensuring that sacred trees shaped both spiritual life and communal behavior. Even within smaller communities, certain trees held immense symbolic power. A lone oak on a hill could become a meeting place for assemblies, a site of justice, or the locus of festivals. Its presence imposed a moral weight on human activity, a reminder that actions carried consequences beyond the immediate. To cut such a tree recklessly was not only sacrilege, but social transgression, punishable by both spiritual and human authority. Trees, in this sense, mediated human relationships, offering sanctuary, judgment, and wisdom through their silent, towering presence. Ultimately, sacred trees across cultures illuminate a shared human understanding that the natural world is infused with life, consciousness, and moral resonance. By venerating trees, ancient peoples acknowledged the intricate interdependence of all existence, the cycles of growth and decay, and the hidden voices that guide human life. These living monuments were teachers, guardians, and divine interlocutors, standing through centuries as bridges between the mortal and eternal. In their shade, humanity first glimpsed the enduring truth that the sacred is not distant, but rooted firmly in the living, breathing world that surrounds us. In the quiet, shadowed heart of the forest, myths were born, stories whispered beneath the canopy, carried from one generation to the next, like seeds on the wind. These were not mere tales of entertainment. They were the lifeblood of culture, memory, and spiritual understanding. Every clearing, every grove, and every sacred tree became a stage upon which gods, spirits, and humans enacted dramas that revealed the mysteries of existence. Love, betrayal, courage, and vengeance unfolded beneath the leaves, weaving lessons about morality, survival, and the delicate balance between humans and the divine. In the shade of ancient oaks and yews, imagination became sacred, and storytelling became ritual. The myths were rooted in the land itself. Hills, rivers, and forests were not passive scenery but active participants in the narrative. A river might rage and claim a life, only to be appeased by offerings and song. A grove could shelter a god's presence, offering visions or prophecy to those who approached with reverence. Every natural feature became a character, every seasonal change a plot point. To wander through these forests was to step into the myth itself, to feel the tension, drama, and moral weight of stories enacted in the living world. Humans did not merely observe, they participated, consciously and unconsciously, in the unfolding of these sacred narratives. In Celtic tradition, the myths often intertwined gods and mortals in intricate moral and emotional webs. Heroes embarked on quests not only for glory, but to honor divine law, to restore balance, or to correct transgression. Deities acted with caprice and passion, testing humans through trials of courage, wisdom, or fidelity. The forests and groves where these stories were told and acted out were imbued with a sense of wonder, danger, and ethical complexity. Each tale was a mirror of life, dramatizing the consequences of action and the delicate interplay between free will and divine influence. Germanic myths emphasized the unpredictability and grandeur of nature, mirrored in gods who wielded storm, fire, and death as instruments of power. Thor's hammer, Odin's wisdom, and Freya's love were not abstract concepts, they were tangible forces, interacting with the world of humans. Battles were fought beneath the boughs of sacred groves, oaths sworn to the rustle of leaves, and prophecies delivered in the whisper of wind through branches. These myths taught that life was interwoven with the divine and that courage, honor, and respect were essential for survival. Here, the forest was simultaneously classroom, courtroom, and theater, shaping behavior and belief with every interaction. In Slavic culture, spirits of the forest and water often featured prominently in storytelling. Trickster figures, protective entities, and capricious spirits embodied the duality of life, blessing and peril, fertility and destruction. Folk tales told of humans who trespassed, disrespected, or ignored the sacred, only to face consequences that reinforced moral and spiritual lessons. Myths became a code, a subtle yet powerful mechanism to transmit ethics, cosmology, and respect for the natural and supernatural order. The grove was both stage and teacher, guiding generations in ways words alone could not accomplish. Myths in these sacred spaces were also communal experiences. They were recited during gatherings, sung during rituals, or enacted in festivals. The repetition of these stories, their embedding in ritual, ensured that the memory of gods, spirits, and moral law persisted even in the absence of writing. In this way, the forest became both a guardian and transmitter of culture. Every tale told beneath its shade reinforced communal identity, ethical norms, and a shared understanding of humanity's place within the vast, mysterious cosmos. Ultimately, the myths that grew in the shade revealed the profound power of storytelling. As a sacred act, they show that humans have always sought meaning in the patterns of the world, attempting to interpret the unseen forces that shape life and death. The groves, the trees, and the whispered leaves were not mere backdrops. They were co-creators of narrative, shaping morality, culture, and belief. In listening to these stories, participating in their enactment, and passing them on, humans entered a dialogue with the divine, a conversation as old as consciousness itself. And in that dialogue, the forest, the gods, and the human imagination became one, ensuring that even centuries later, the sacred lessons born in shadowed groves would continue to resonate. The forest has always been a paradox, a place of sanctuary and a theater of terror. For ancient peoples, the sacred grove was not simply a space of reverence. It was a realm of unpredictability, where life and death, blessing and curse, danced in delicate balance. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. Rustling leaves carried whispers from unseen eyes, and every footstep could be a trespass upon forces both protective and wrathful. Fear and wonder were inseparable here. The same oak that sheltered a ritual could conceal a predator or a spirit's wrath. In this duality, humans first understood the immense power of the natural world and the gods who resided within it. Fear-shaped ritual. Offerings were left not merely in gratitude, but to avert misfortune, sacrifices enacted to appease unseen powers. The smallest oversight, a branch broken, a fire unattended, a whispered insult to the sacred, could invite calamity. Yet this fear was not paralyzing. It was attentive, cultivated, and disciplined. It demanded that humans observe, respect, and act with intention. In doing so, the sacred grove became both a place of spiritual education and moral apprenticeship, teaching that humility before the divine and nature was essential for survival. At the same time, the forest inspired awe. Towering trees, gnarled roots, and sunlight filtering through leaves created landscapes that seemed otherworldly, almost alive with presence. Mist rising from riverbeds, the distant howl of wolves, or the sudden flight of birds could be interpreted as signs of divine favor, messages of prophecy, or simply glimpses into the ineffable. Wonder encouraged imagination, devotion, and communal storytelling. It forged the myths and legends that humans would carry across generations, ensuring that even in the absence of written language, the sacred knowledge of the groves endured. The duality of fear and wonder is evident in Norse and Celtic traditions alike. The Norse feared the hidden dangers of Yggdrasil's roots, yet revered its cosmic authority. The Celts warned of spirits and capricious forces inhabiting rivers and trees, yet celebrated the protection and wisdom these very entities provided. These cultures understood that divinity was not inherently benevolent. It reflected the universe itself capricious, complex, and awe-inspiring. To live in harmony with it required courage, attentiveness, and respect. Humans were neither masters nor passive observers. They were participants in an intricate, living drama. Even animals contributed to this tension. A deer stepping through a grove could signify abundance, while the sudden scream of a predator might portend danger or divine displeasure. Birds were messengers, insects omens, and the wind carried stories in its sighs and roars. Every living presence within the sacred forest had significance, reinforcing the idea that life was interconnected, that the boundary between the ordinary and the supernatural was permeable, and that the natural world was inseparable from moral and spiritual law. The forests also embodied temporal lessons. The cycles of seasons mirrored human life, and observing the forest taught the inevitability of growth, decay, and renewal. To witness a tree stripped bare by winter, only to bloom again in spring, was to comprehend mortality, resilience, and the promise of rebirth. Fear and wonder intertwined here, showing humans the precariousness of existence and the beauty of perseverance. It was in these lessons that ancient people learned ethics, courage, and reverence, not from abstract doctrine, but from lived, tactile experience in the living cathedral of the grove. The turning of the seasons was a cosmic heartbeat to which early humans attuned themselves, and sacred groves became the stages upon which the rhythm of life was celebrated, mourned, and interpreted. Festivals were not mere celebrations. They were living embodiments of the cycles of nature, acts of devotion, and communal reaffirmations of the sacred order. Spring brought renewal and fertility. Summer, abundance and growth. Autumn, harvest and reflection. Winter, rest, introspection, and the honoring of ancestors. Each rite was a conscious participation in the eternal rhythm, a dance in which humans aligned themselves with the patterns of the natural and divine world. Spring rites often centered on fertility, growth, and the promise of life. Communities would gather in sacred groves to plant seeds, bless fields, and honor deities responsible for abundance. Flowers, grains, and water were offered in ritualized gestures, acknowledging the power of the divine to sustain and renew. These celebrations were often exuberant, filled with music, dance, and the bright energy of life returning after the dormancy of winter. Yet beneath the joy lay profound recognition of vulnerability. Life was fragile, dependent upon unseen forces, and every blessing demanded gratitude and respect. Summer festivals celebrated abundance and vitality, often marked by communal feasts beneath the towering oaks and yews. Fire played a central role, symbolizing the sun's strength, purification, and divine presence. Communities would sing, dance, and engage in ceremonial competitions, affirming social bonds and collective identity. These rites were as much about reinforcing human cohesion as they were about honoring the gods. They reminded participants that prosperity was a shared responsibility and that the sacred and social realms were inseparable. Autumn rites turned attention toward harvest, death, and reflection. The shedding leaves mirrored human mortality, and rituals acknowledged the impermanence of life and the cycles of decay that made renewal possible. Offerings of food, grain, or crafted items were placed in groves to honor spirits and deities, seeking protection for the coming months and expressing gratitude for the abundance that had sustained the community. These ceremonies balanced celebration and solemnity, joy and melancholy, teaching participants that life's bounty and life's loss are intertwined, inseparable threads in the fabric of existence. Winter rites emphasized introspection, the honoring of ancestors, and preparation for the new cycle. Fires were lit, songs and stories recited, and sacred spaces illuminated with the glow of ritual flame. Communities reflected on the lessons of the past year, seeking guidance for the future. The groves, though quieter, were no less sacred. In the stillness of frost and snow, the presence of the divine felt even more palpable. These rites were exercises in patience, endurance, and wisdom, teaching that even in apparent death, life and divinity endure beneath the surface, waiting to bloom again. Rituals were often accompanied by music, dance, and oral storytelling, creating a sensory tapestry that deepened participants' immersion in the sacred. Drums echoed the pulse of the earth. Flutes imitated the wind through trees, chanting synchronized human breath with the rhythm of the cosmos. Through these practices, festivals became communal experiences of awe, wonder, and moral instruction. They were the living classrooms of society, ensuring that knowledge of gods, nature, and ethical conduct passed seamlessly from generation to generation. Ultimately, festivals and seasonal rites were more than religious observances. They were embodiments of humanity's earliest understanding of time, mortality, and the sacred. By participating, humans aligned themselves with the cycles of the universe, reinforced communal bonds, and cultivated reverence for forces far greater than themselves. In the groves, beneath the whispering leaves, every step, gesture, and song was a bridge between mortal and divine, a recognition that life is a rhythm and that to live consciously is to honor the eternal pulse of the cosmos. In the dense shadows of sacred groves, humans first noticed the animals that shared their world not merely as companions or resources, but as living symbols of divine power and presence. Deer, wolves, birds of prey, serpents, and even insects were imbued with significance, becoming messengers, guardians, and embodiments of the gods themselves. The movements, calls, and behaviors of these creatures were read as signs, portents, or guidance. A stag stepping through a glade might herald prosperity or transformation. A wolf prowling nearby could signify both danger and protection. Animals were not separate from the sacred, they were integral, living threads in the web connecting humans, nature, and divinity. Totem animals became central to identity and spiritual practice. Tribes or clans often adopted particular animals as emblems of lineage, strength, or moral qualities. To embody the fox was to embrace cunning. To emulate the bear was to honor courage and resilience. To revere the eagle was to reach for vision and insight. These relationships were reciprocal. Humans offered respect, ritual, and offerings, while animals, real or symbolic, served as guides, protectors, and teachers. Totems were living metaphors, and to understand them was to understand one's place within the larger cosmos, the interconnectedness of all life, and the moral obligations that came with awareness. Many myths grew from these interactions between humans and sacred animals. Celtic tales recounted the guidance of white stags leading hunters into enchanted realms. Germanic sagas celebrated wolves and ravens as companions of gods, heralding victories or disasters. Slavic stories depicted spirits inhabiting animals, warning communities of unseen forces. These stories did more than entertain, they encoded moral lessons, cosmological truths, and survival knowledge. In observing and interpreting the behavior of sacred animals, humans learned humility, patience, and attentiveness, virtues essential to coexistence with forces both visible and invisible. Rituals involving animals were both symbolic and practical. Some animals were offered as sacrifices, a tangible exchange intended to honor gods or spirits, and to maintain cosmic balance. Others were celebrated through symbolic representation. Figurines, masks, or ceremonial garb invoked the qualities of the creature without taking its life. These practices reinforced ethical and spiritual principles, teaching that sacred power is neither casual nor capricious, and that human actions carry consequences beyond immediate perception. The line between reverence and exploitation was carefully observed, a principle that shaped social conduct and ecological awareness. Birds held a special place in pagan spirituality. Their ability to traverse sky, tree, and earth made them messengers between realms, intermediaries capable of carrying prayers and omen. A raven perched upon an oak, a swallow in flight, or an owl at dusk could all deliver messages from gods or ancestors. Observing their patterns became a discipline, requiring patience, mindfulness, and interpretive skill. Bird behavior was read as divine language, a constant reminder that the sacred often communicates in subtle, indirect ways, requiring humans to cultivate awareness and humility. Predators and dangerous creatures carried dual meanings, embodying both fear and reverence. Wolves, bears, and serpents symbolized destructive power, yet their presence affirmed balance within nature and human society. Respect for these animals meant acknowledging limits, understanding consequences, and embracing courage. Hunting, tracking, and observing these creatures became forms of both spiritual and practical education, reinforcing the interdependence between humans, animals, and the sacred forces that govern life. Ultimately, sacred animals and totems reveal a worldview in which humanity is not the center but a participant in a larger, living moral universe. These creatures were teachers, guardians, and mirrors, reflecting both divine will and human potential. To honor them was to recognize the interconnectedness of existence, to navigate the delicate balance of fear and respect, and to engage in an intimate dialogue with the forces that shape life. In the groves and forests where humans first understood these truths, the sacred was never abstract. It walked, crawled, and flew alongside them, a constant presence, guiding, warning, and inspiring. The soft murmur of a river through a grove is a voice older than memory, carrying stories from mountains to valleys, from the living to the dead. To ancient peoples, water was more than a necessity, it was a living, sacred entity. Rivers, springs, and lakes were thought to be imbued with divine presence, gateways to the otherworld, and sources of both healing and destruction. Pilgrims approached these waters with reverence, leaving offerings, uttering prayers, and performing rituals to honor the spirits that dwelled within. A single ripple or whirlpool could be interpreted as a sign, a blessing, or a warning, and humans learned to read these subtle cues as part of an ongoing dialogue with the divine. Sacred waters were often tied to life's pivotal moments. Birth, initiation, and purification rituals frequently incorporated immersion or contact with rivers and springs. The act of washing in sacred water symbolized cleansing of both body and spirit, a rebirth into a life aligned with cosmic rhythms. Healing waters were believed to cure ailments, restore vitality, and strengthen spiritual vision. These practices reinforce the idea that water was a conduit between the mortal and divine, capable of transmitting energy, insight, and protection. To touch the sacred river was to touch a force beyond oneself, a tangible connection to eternity. Water was not only symbolic, but deeply practical. Rivers provided sustenance, transportation, and natural boundaries, and the act of honoring them reinforced conservation and ethical stewardship. Misuse, pollution, overfishing, or disrespect was believed to anger the spirits, inviting misfortune or scarcity. In this way, sacred waters encoded moral, ecological, and social lessons, shaping human behavior through both reverence and fear. The gods, flowing through streams and eddies, reminded communities that life was an interconnected web, and that survival depended upon harmony with the natural world. Many myths grew from the power of sacred waters. Tales of river spirits luring the unwary, lakes concealing treasures or divine beings, and wells granting visions of the future permeated oral traditions. These narratives conveyed ethical imperatives, such as respect for boundaries, gratitude for resources, and courage in the face of uncertainty. They also affirmed that the natural world, animated by spirit, was not passive. It demanded attention, humility, and moral integrity. Myths and ritual reinforced each other, creating a living system of knowledge in which the sacred and mundane were inseparable. Seasonal rites often revolved around rivers, marking moments of transition and cosmic alignment. Spring festivals celebrated melting snow and swelling streams, invoking fertility and renewal. Autumnal rituals honored rivers' bounty as they carried the harvest downstream, acknowledging the cycles of life and death. Even winter, when waters froze or receded, was a time of reflection and offerings, preparing for the return of flow and vitality. By embedding ritual within these natural rhythms, humans cultivated a profound temporal awareness, recognizing the passage of time and the cyclical nature of existence. Amid the forest floor and rolling hills, stone stood silently, immovable yet imbued with presence. To ancient peoples, certain rocks and megaliths were not merely geological formations, they were vessels of power, anchors of the sacred, and witnesses to the unfolding of human life. Monuments such as standing stones, dolmens, and stone circles marked points where earth, sky, and spirit intersected. To touch a sacred stone was to touch the pulse of the cosmos, to acknowledge forces older and vaster than any individual human. In their permanence, these stones conveyed endurance, memory, and the continuity of divine presence across generations. Many cultures believe that sacred stones contain spirits or divine essence. A boulder at the confluence of rivers could be inhabited by a guardian spirit. A carved stone could embody a deity's presence. Offerings of food, crafted items, or symbols of devotion were left at these stones to honor the divine and seek guidance, protection, or favor. These interactions were reciprocal. Humans acknowledged the power inherent in the stones, and in return, the stones conferred insight, blessing, or moral instruction. The act of leaving an offering was a contract of respect, humility, and awareness of one's place in the universe. The alignment of stones with celestial events demonstrates the sophistication of ancient observation. At Stonehenge, the rising sun at midsummer illuminates the heel stone in a precise display of cosmic choreography. Similar arrangements across Europe, from the Callanish stones in Scotland to Karnak in France, show that prehistoric peoples integrated astronomy, ritual, and sacred space into a holistic understanding of existence. The stones were not merely markers. They were instruments for interpreting time, predicting seasonal change, and maintaining harmony between human activity and the cosmos. Rites performed at sacred stones were as varied as the stones themselves. Some commemorated the dead, creating enduring monuments that connected generations. Others marked legal and social boundaries, serving as courts of judgment or gathering places for councils. Still others were used for divination, with the placement of stones or the observation of natural phenomena providing insight into human affairs. In each case, the stone was a conduit, grounding human action in spiritual principle and natural law. The myths surrounding sacred stones reflect humanity's deep engagement with permanence and memory. Stories often tell of giants, gods, or ancestors shaping the stones, imbuing them with power, or using them as bridges between worlds. The stones were living memory, repositories of events, wisdom, and moral instruction. By interacting with them, humans connected with the past, acknowledged the present, and prepared for the future. In these enduring markers, the sacred became tangible, visible, and profoundly human. Ultimately, sacred stones and monuments remind us that humans have long sought permanence in a transient world. They embody memory, reverence, and cosmic order, anchoring communities in space, time, and belief. These stones were not passive. They demanded attention, respect, and moral integrity. In their immovable presence, they taught lessons of endurance, humility, and continuity. Standing before such a monument, humans encountered the silent, steadfast gaze of eternity, a reminder that the sacred is etched into the very fabric of the earth, waiting for those who would see, honor, and remember. In the shadowed groves where sunlight flickered across moss and stone, early humans first glimpsed the inseparability of life and death. These sacred spaces were neither wholly joyous nor entirely somber. They were liminal, suspended between beginnings and endings. Birth, growth, decay, and death unfolded beneath the branches of ancient trees and beside flowing waters, offering constant lessons in the cyclical nature of existence. Life and death were not opposites, but intertwined threads in the same tapestry, each defining and giving meaning to the other. In observing the forest, humans saw the inevitability of mortality and the persistence of life, and in this recognition, they began to cultivate both reverence and resilience. Death was never treated as an end, but as a passage, a transition into realms that coexisted with the living world. Groves, rivers, stones, and monuments all served as thresholds where the mortal soul could commune with divine forces or ancestral spirits. Burial practices, offerings, and funerary rites reflected the understanding that death demanded respect, ritual, and acknowledgement of its power. Human remains were placed carefully within sacred landscapes beneath trees, near rivers, or within stone chambers, ensuring that the departed remained woven into the ongoing fabric of life. Through these practices, death became a teacher, a guide, and a moral compass for the living. Life and death were mirrored in the cycles of nature. Leaves sprouted, grew, decayed, and fell. Animals were born, thrived, and perished. Rivers swelled and receded. Observing these cycles, humans recognized that mortality was not an aberration but a natural rhythm, a component of the sacred order. These observations were internalized through ritual, myth, and daily practice, reinforcing an ethic of humility, patience, and respect for the balance of existence. To honor life was simultaneously to honor death, and to disregard either was to disrupt the harmony of the natural and spiritual worlds. The integration of life and death shaped cosmology and spirituality. Gods of fertility and harvest were inseparable from deities of decay and the underworld. In Norse mythology, the cycles of Yggdrasil reflected both creation and destruction, showing that growth cannot exist without decline and that endings are merely preludes to renewal. Celtic traditions similarly intertwined death with transformation, emphasizing that souls, energy, and spirit flowed through existence, cycling between worlds and generations. The sacred groves and monuments were physical manifestations of these principles, spaces in which humans could witness, honor, and participate in the eternal rhythm. Rituals surrounding death were also pedagogical. Communities learned courage, compassion, and foresight through funerary ceremonies and the observation of natural decay. The placement of offerings, the recitation of stories, and the careful tending of burial sites reinforced the moral and social order. These acts of remembrance preserved cultural memory, transmitted knowledge, and cultivated an awareness that life's continuity depended on attentiveness, respect, and ethical conduct. Death, in this context, was not feared as annihilation, but embraced as a necessary and instructive component of existence. Animals and sacred symbols further reinforced the interweaving of life and death. Predators, scavengers, and the cycles of animal life mirrored human mortality, teaching lessons in balance, survival, and humility. Sacred stones and waters too marked transitions, serving as guides, portals, and witnesses. Every element of the sacred landscape became a teacher, reminding humans that life is fleeting, interconnected, and charged with moral and spiritual significance. In this integration, fear and reverence coexisted, shaping behavior, belief, and communal cohesion. Ultimately, the interweaving of life and death reveals a profound understanding embedded within pagan spirituality. Existence is a continuous dialogue between beginnings and endings, growth and decay, the mortal and the divine. Sacred groves, rivers, stones, and animals all participated in this dance, offering guidance, perspective, and moral instruction. By embracing the inevitability of death while honoring the vitality of life, humans cultivated a wisdom that transcended fear, grounded society, and aligned the individual with the eternal rhythms of the cosmos. In the groves where life and death intertwined, humans first learned the sacred truth that to live fully is inseparable from the recognition of mortality, and that every ending carries the seed of renewal. In the quiet sanctuaries of sacred groves, fire was more than a tool. It was a living, breathing presence, a conduit between the human and the divine. Its flickering light illuminated the mysteries of night, transforming shadows into movement and ordinary trees and stones into sacred witnesses. To ancient peoples, fire embodied both creation and destruction, warmth and danger, life and purification. It was a mediator between the tangible and the intangible, a symbol of the god's presence and a central element in rituals that sought to align human action with the cosmic order. Fire was central to rites of passage. Initiations, marriages, and funerary ceremonies often incorporated flames, representing transformation and the crossing of thresholds. To step into the circle of fire was to step into a liminal space, a place where the ordinary world dissolved and the sacred could be accessed. Sparks leaping into the night air were interpreted as messages or blessings from unseen forces, while the smoke carried prayers upward, bridging the realms of mortals and gods. In this interplay of light, heat, and movement, humans encountered both awe and humility, recognizing the fragile yet potent nature of life. Seasonal festivals relied heavily on fire as a symbol of cosmic energy. Winter solstice celebrations often involved fire to invoke the return of the sun, guiding communities through the darkest days. Summer solstice fires celebrated abundance, growth, and vitality, illuminating sacred spaces while marking the apex of the sun's power. Through these rituals, fire became a living calendar, signaling transitions in both the natural world and human society. Its presence was a reminder of cycles, permanence within change, and the necessity of participating actively in the rhythms of life. Sacrificial rites frequently incorporated fire, transforming offerings into smoke, heat, and ash. Food, crafted items, or symbolic objects were consumed by the flame, an act of devotion and surrender to divine will. Fire transmuted the material into the spiritual, carrying human intention into realms beyond perception. The act was deeply psychological, reinforcing humility, attentiveness, and the understanding that life was a continual exchange with forces greater than oneself. To witness or participate in these rituals was to confront both the potential for destruction and the promise of renewal inherent in the natural and spiritual worlds. Fire also served as a tool for divination and prophecy, observing the behavior of flames, the direction of smoke, and the way sparks leapt from the hearth could reveal insight, warn of danger, or confirm guidance from gods or spirits. In Celtic, Norse, and Slavic traditions alike, the flame was an oracle, unpredictable yet interpretable by those trained to listen and observe. The light and shadow cast by fire became a mirror of moral and cosmic order, teaching that attentiveness, patience, and discernment were essential for navigating both human and divine realms. Communal gatherings around fire fostered unity, storytelling, and cultural continuity. Songs, chants, and narratives told in the glow of flames transmitted history, ethics, and cosmology. The fire itself became a participant, casting its energy onto the listeners, binding them together in a shared experience of awe, reflection, and reverence. These gatherings reinforced the moral and social fabric of the community, showing that sacred practice was as much about collective identity as individual devotion. Ultimately, fire in sacred practices embodies the duality at the heart of pagan spirituality. It is both destructive and creative, terrifying and illuminating, mortal and divine. By honoring fire, humans acknowledge the transformative power of the universe, the fragility and potential of life, and the necessity of conscious, intentional action. In groves, by rivers, and beside standing stones, the flame became a teacher, a witness, and a bridge, a reminder that the sacred is never inert, but alive, responsive, and intertwined with every gesture of devotion, courage, and reflection. Fire is the pulse of the ritual, the spark of consciousness, and the ever-present illumination of the divine within and around us. As the centuries turned, the vast forests and sacred groves that had nurtured pagan belief came under the shadow of empire. Roman legions, with their roads, walls, and unyielding authority, began to impose order upon lands where gods and spirits had long held sway. Sacred spaces, once free and revered, became threatened. Trees were felled for timber, rivers redirected, and stones toppled or repurposed. The intimate dialogue between humans and the divine, the rustling leaves, the murmuring waters, the silent stones was disrupted by the march of imperial law, conquest, and ideology. Yet even as pagan practices waned under imperial dominance, the sacred memory of groves, stones, and rivers persisted, whispered in secret rituals and hidden glades. Roman authorities often sought to suppress indigenous religions, branding them as superstition or rebellion. Temples were erected to Roman gods, festivals reorganized, and local priests or druids pressured to adopt new roles or abandon their traditions entirely. The sacred groves, previously autonomous and inviolable, were vulnerable to imperial control. Yet even in the face of coercion, resistance persisted, not always overt, but in the careful maintenance of hidden rituals, clandestine offerings, and oral transmission of sacred knowledge. Humanity's need to commune with the divine could not be extinguished entirely by decree or sword. Some pagan sites were transformed rather than destroyed, assimilated into the imperial religious framework. A grove could become the foundation for a Roman temple. A river goddess might be reinterpreted as a nymph within Roman mythology. In these adaptations, the sacred persisted in subtle, often invisible forms. Human imagination and devotion found ways to survive, to weave continuity between old and new, and to preserve the essence of ritual even under foreign dominance. In this cultural layering, the past was never wholly erased, it was reborn, disguised yet enduring beneath new structures. The suppression of pagan practice also had profound psychological and social consequences. Communities who had relied on sacred groves, ritual cycles, and natural omens for guidance now faced dislocation. Moral, social, and spiritual frameworks embedded in the landscape were disrupted. Humans, once intimately attuned to the rhythms of the sacred, were forced to navigate unfamiliar systems of law, faith, and authority. Yet, in private, in whispered prayers, and in the quiet of forests still untamed, the old knowledge persisted, demonstrating the resilience of belief and the human longing for connection to forces greater than ourselves. Despite imperial dominance, certain aspects of pagan spirituality continued to shape European culture, often subtly. Festivals timed to solstices and equinoxes survived in adapted forms, myths and stories persisted orally, and reverence for certain trees, stones, and waters remained deeply ingrained in local custom. Even when pagan gods were officially forgotten, their memory lingered in names, folklore, and ritualized behaviors, a testament to the endurance of sacred imagination. The empire could suppress practice, but it could not fully erase the human impulse to honor the sacred in the world around them. The decline under empire also inspired reflection on mortality, power, and resilience. Humans saw that even mighty political forces were transient, that authority could reshape landscapes and institutions, but the natural and spiritual worlds endured. Sacred groves continued to grow, rivers continued to flow, stones remained steadfast, and the memory of ritual persisted. In this contrast between impermanence and endurance, humans found lessons about humility, continuity, and the subtle ways in which sacred forces shape life, even under the heaviest weight of history. Ultimately, the encroachment of empire reveals the tension between human power and the sacred, between conquest and continuity. It demonstrates that while authority can suppress practice, it cannot fully sever the human connection to the divine or erase the memory of what has been revered. Sacred groves, rivers, stones, and fires may be threatened, repurposed, or hidden, yet they endure in memory, myth, and ritual, awaiting rediscovery and revival. The decline under empire is not an end, it is a pause, a shadow over the enduring pulse of the sacred, whispering that the past, though suppressed, is never truly gone. Even as empires rose and religion shifted, the spirit of the sacred groves, stones, rivers, and fires refused to vanish entirely. In villages and hamlets scattered across Europe, remnants of the old ways persisted, tucked into folk traditions, seasonal festivals, and whispered stories. Elders remembered the rites of planting and harvest, the significance of sacred trees, and the guidance of animals as omens. Children grew up hearing tales of spirits, heroes, and gods who walked unseen. And even in the absence of formal practice, the memory of the sacred continued to shape the human imagination. These fragments of memory became a lifeline, preserving the rhythms and ethics of pagan life across centuries of change. Folk customs often disguised the old ways under the guise of new faiths. Pagan solstices and equinoxes survived as Christian feast days. Sacred trees became parish use. River spirits were reinterpreted as saints or angels. Yet beneath these new forms lay continuity, a persistent reverence for the natural world and the cycles of life and death. Songs, dances, and processions carried echoes of ancient rituals, and oral storytelling kept alive the myths and moral lessons once enacted in groves and by sacred stones. Humanity's longing for the sacred could not be extinguished. It adapted, transformed, and endured. Animals retained their symbolic power within folk memory. Deer, wolves, bears, and birds appeared in fables and local legends, teaching cunning, bravery, and wisdom. Even as formal belief systems shifted, the moral and spiritual significance of these creatures persisted, guiding human behavior and offering metaphors for understanding life's mysteries. In some regions, animals were still offered symbolic devotion, their images carved into homes, ritual objects, or talismans, maintaining an invisible thread connecting the present to the sacred past. Rivers, springs, and wells continued to hold magical significance, even as Christian and imperial authorities attempted to redefine their meaning. Pilgrims sought healing in holy waters, unaware that their practices echoed ancient rites. Villagers offered coins, bread, or prayers, maintaining continuity with ancestors who had done the same for centuries. In these acts, the sacred became layered old and new traditions intertwined, revealing a remarkable resilience of human devotion and memory. The past persisted not as rigid doctrine but as living practice, adaptive and deeply human. Sacred stones also retained a quiet, enduring presence. Stone circles, dolmens, and standing stones became sites of curiosity, folklore, and hidden ritual. Myths persisted about giants, spirits, and hidden treasures inhabiting these ancient markers, and in some communities, the stones continued to function as gathering places for rites of passage, seasonal festivals, or divination. Even when stripped of overt religious meaning, the stones retained their aura, reminding humanity of the deep, enduring connection between Earth, cosmos, and the human spirit. The resurgence of folk memory demonstrates humanity's capacity to preserve sacred knowledge in subtle and resilient ways. When empires, religions, or social change threatened to erase old practices, communities adapted, embedding memory into narrative, custom, and celebration. This persistence shows that spirituality is not dependent solely on formal structures. It thrives in human consciousness, imagination, and ethical practice. Through song, story, ritual, and observance of nature, the sacred continued to pulse, quietly shaping life, morality, and community identity. Ultimately, the resurgence of folk memory is a testament to the resilience of the sacred. Groves, rivers, stones, and fires may be hidden, forgotten, or repurposed, yet their presence endures in the imagination, customs, and stories of those who remember. Through adaptation and continuity, the essence of pagan spirituality survived, ensuring that the wisdom of the old ways of life intertwined with the divine, of respect for nature, and of moral attentiveness remained alive, waiting to be recognized and honored once more. The past was never truly lost. It was carried forward, quietly, patiently, and eternally. Even now, when the forests have receded and stones have been scattered, the pulse of the sacred continues to beat beneath the surface of human life. The groves where gods once walked, the rivers where spirits lingered, and the fires that danced in devotion have not vanished. They endure in memory, in ritual, and in the very rhythms of existence. In quiet woods, where sunlight fractures through leaves, or beside a river whose flow has known centuries, the echoes of ancient devotion can still be felt. The sacred is not bound by time. It lives in perception, in reverence, and in the intimate dialogue between humans and the world around them. The stories, myths, and rituals of pagan Europe are not merely relics of the past. They are living testimonies to the human desire for connection with forces greater than oneself. Even as formal practice declined, these stories shaped culture, ethics, and imagination. Tales of gods, heroes, and spirits guided human behavior, offering lessons in courage, humility, and moral discernment. Every festival, every seasonal rite, every whispered legend ensured that the sacred remained an active presence, influencing communities in ways both subtle and profound. Sacred landscapes, trees, rivers, stones continue to carry memory, functioning as anchors between the mortal and the divine. Modern travelers and seekers who pause beneath an ancient oak or beside a glimmering spring participate, even unknowingly, in an ancient lineage of observation, devotion, and reflection. The earth itself, patient and enduring, preserves the energy and intention of countless generations. To stand in these spaces is to feel time collapse, to sense that humans have always sought communion with the sacred, and that such communion transcends the strictures of history, empire, or religion. Animals, too, remain symbols and messengers of the sacred. Birds that glide silently overhead, deer that move through quiet glades, and even the hum of insects carry echoes of meaning, reminding humans of the interdependence of life and the moral and spiritual weight of presence. Observing them requires attentiveness, respect, and humility, virtues that have endured from the earliest encounters between humans and the world they inhabited. In these creatures, the living pulse of sacred wisdom continues to speak, bridging the chasm between past and present. The cycles of life and death, so central to pagan understanding, remain constant, Seasons turn, life emerges, decays, and renews itself, echoing the lessons inscribed in groves, rivers, and stones. Humans, too, participate in these rhythms, whether consciously or unconsciously, carrying forward the understanding that mortality and vitality, destruction and creation are inseparable aspects of existence. By observing, honoring, and reflecting upon these cycles, modern humans reconnect with truths that guided their ancestors, that life is sacred, fleeting, and intertwined with forces beyond comprehension. In many ways, the endurance of these sacred practices and memories illustrates a profound truth. The past is never entirely gone. It resides in the landscapes we traverse, in the customs we inherit, and in the stories that continue to shape our imagination and ethics. Sacred groves may no longer serve as public ritual spaces, but their essence persists in the human capacity for wonder, reflection, and reverence. The divine, once approached through trees, rivers, stones, and fire, continues to be encountered wherever humans recognize and honor the extraordinary within the ordinary. Ultimately, the eternal pulse of the sacred teaches that history is not a closed book, but a living conversation. The groves, rivers, stones, fires, animals, and myths of ancient Europe remind us that humans have always sought meaning, connection, and guidance in the world around them. That desire endures, patient and resilient, inviting each generation to listen, observe, and participate. Because the past is never truly gone, it's waiting to be reborn.